The Anno responded to the Kiratan secession by sending one of its most loyal generals, Tyrant of Delamar, with an armada of ships and soldiers to suppress the anti-annorum. The transit from Karakis to Kiratan took roughly a decade real-time. By the time the armada arrived in orbit about Kiratan, the Kirati were ready and the situation in Anno-rate space had changed dramatically. From the moment of arrival, the Kirati plagued Tyrant's ships with surface-to-orbit missiles, destroying numerous shuttles before soldiers were able to land. When they did disembark, they found the Kirati had refined their mines into fortresses and forged their peasant levies into an efficient professional army, ensuring the coming fight was a brutal affair. Tyrant's campaign ended a handful of years after landfall. A communications packet arrived in system, ordering a halt to any engagements by word of the Anno, or rather, the Anno apparent, who was currently in transit to Karakis from Ispasalar. A series of conflicting communications packets followed, evidently sent in close proximity to one another. The emperor was dead, and his heir was en route not from Ispasalar, but Iolete. The heir was illegitimate, and a true successor had been seated on throne Karakis. The successor on the throne, by virtue of temporal anomalies due to relativistic travel, was actually younger than they claimed to be, and the true successor had declared their capital in Old Cosimo on Karakis. Other colonies, as a result of the emperor's passing, had followed Kiratan's example and declared themselves independent of the annorum or allied with Kiratan. The effects of sublight relativistic travel had finally overwhelmed the overstressed bureaucracy, and the Anno had no method for dealing with competing legitimate claims. Unsure of how to proceed, but exhausted by the multi-year campaign, Tyrant ordered his forces to halt. He requested peace talks with the Kirati, who had also borne witness to the communications blasts broadcasted in system, and brokered a peace agreement. Tyrant and his army would leave Kiratan, de facto granting them their independence, and travel home to Karakis to enforce peace until the true heir could be determined. At this time, even after the war on Kiratan, Tyrant's army and its fleet was the most powerful and professional fighting force the annorum had together, rivaled only by the Anno-rate guard garrisoned on Karakis. With his ranks bolstered by Kirati Anno loyalists, Tyrant and his army left Kiratan and began their long isolated journey home. Prior to integration into Union, the Karakans had no access to omni-net communication or blink travel. While underway, messages between ships in transit and their destination were subject to the intense delay of light-based communication between objects in space. Because of this lag, Karakan naval protocol was conservative, and it was standard practice to quiet a ship's communications centers save for a small officer corps responsible for timelining the messages, placing them in context before issuing them out to the crew. Tyrant's fleet, upon realignment into local Karakan space, was met with a cacophony of communiques, a confusion of competing calls for his ship identities and loyalties. Various factions on Karakis and in local space delivered ultimatums, demanded to know who Tyrant fought for, and insisted that he surrender his weapons. After a decade of real-time travel, Tyrant's army was eager to make landfall, but rather than invade, Tyrant held his forces back. Gathering his ships in orbit above Karakis, Tyrant met with his communications officers aboard his flagship and opened communications with the world below. Seeking a reprieve from the countless targeting beams, firing solutions, and encroaching picket ships, Tyrant announced that he acted in service of Karakis. He would not fire upon any who stayed clear of his fleet's local space, nor would he land his soldiers. Instead, Tyrant said, he would wait for the world below to declare its intent. Meanwhile, Tyrant's officer corps worked to determine the situation on the ground, who his allies were, who ruled the annorum, and which of the factions encroaching on their fleet space posed the largest threat. Their initial survey returned grim data. Karakis was crisscrossed with muddy wasteland battlescapes, long networks of static trench lines spidered out around factories, cities, and strategic points, everywhere packed with millions of conscripted soldiers, peasant levies, and mercenaries. Whole forests burned freely or had been burned away. The annorum's central palace had all but been bombed to rubble, as had Reese, Cosimo, and Delamar. A massive crater marked the northern pole of Karakis, where a projectile launched by separatists on Iolete had flung an asteroid into the world. The Anno was dead, his body unrecovered, and the factions supporting the many heirs who had claimed birthrights and raised armies from the world's population had devolved into petty war bands. Beyond Kiratan, 4 of the annorum's other worlds, Ispasalar, Iolete, Tilimsan, and Begum, had declared their independence, embroiling the Anno-rate guard and its remaining ships in a slew of colonial suppression operations. Tyrant and his army had stepped into a multi-part polytemporal struggle to determine the heir to the annorum Passacaglia, and the first interplanetary war in human history. Exhausted, his leader dead with no clear heir, his home city reduced to rubble, his homeworld cold beneath a blanket of ash, rain, and stagnating trench warfare, Tyrant made his move. His response to all hails was simple, a curt statement now immortalized at the base of his monument on Caracas: "I serve the people of Caracas, and its throne." Tyrant ordered his battleships to open fire upon all ships targeting his fleet, and for his army to prepare for one last invasion, Caracas. The campaign, later called Tyrant's Landing, was swift and brutal, targeting from orbit the presumed headquarters of all heirs, all military production plants, and garrisons of significant size. His fleet, even 2 decades out of date, had been the largest concentration of military ships and ordnance ever put into space, and remained so after the massive splintering of Caracan forces. The volume of ordnance rained down on Caracas was terrible enough to trigger global seismic activity, destabilizing and demoralizing the entrenched peasant levies and conscript armies. At night, during the early days of Tyrant's Landing, the sky was lit with the brilliant novae of successor ships flaring nuclear as Tyrant's battleships engaged all comers that did not surrender themselves to his mandate. This opening salvo marked the end of the annorum Passacaglia. For the better half of a week, Tyrant's battle-worn veterans fought in the halls of the massive annorum palace complex, rooting out the last of the besieged annorate guard that refused to surrender. The throne room itself was breached on the 7th day of the invasion, with Tyrant leading the first wave into the facility. There, his forces found the last of the annorate guard, their highest commanders and most die-hard veterans, and engaged them in a brutal melee. The first time I visited Throne Caracas, I did so against the guns of the annorate guard. I was a man of line in Tyrant's levies, a veteran of his wars on Kiratan and the long journey between worlds. I was born on Ispasalar, and an old man of 53, as I perceived it, when we stormed Throne. I had never breathed the royal air, I would not breathe it for years more, as my sealed suit was necessary to keep me from death. I promised myself, I remember this, as our dropship carried me through flak, that I would one day return in the warm sun of peace, and breathe royal air, for it must be sweet to be kept from us. The battle to that point had been one fought under the stern faces of patricians and Passacaglias, those who had ruled us, from distant, for time since before I could remember, in stone and monument. These the ancient halls wandered only by the bare feet of Passacaglia's thousand children, these ancient halls only ever kissed by the sound of laughter and song, now the booted tromp of soldiery and the thunder sound of our cannon and gun. Did I profane the place I fought to save? Can one profane a place corrupted by the ones who haunt it? Questions for robed men and women, not for me. My task was to fight. I led a unit of men O-line, some the sons of those elders who had left with us for Kiratan, others my brothers in age and veterancy. By the annorum's word, we had seen all the world and void but for its heart, Caracas, fair one. My veterans had been cast out of this garden, as I said, from a neighboring plot, to a distant ungrateful land of mud and haze, told our prize was to claim it for this crown, this throne. We did and were abandoned, by vote and voice we demanded our right, and Tyrant promised it, so who else would we follow? None but him. From the belly of our drop ship, under ashen royal skies, we fought to the heart of the throne. I laid low many by harshot and blade, and was first to the great sealed doors of the Passacaglian throne. Craterus and Antigonus, my seconds, had been wounded, but they held each other up, slouched over their belt feds. I had cut a loophole in the golden doors with my pen beam, and felt a responsibility for their wounds, as the annorate guard had shoved their weapons from the hole and blasted, blind, towards us. Brave Craterus fired back, striking many of them, hollering Antigonus' name, for he loved him dearly. His efforts saved Antigonus and I, and the rest of my men, and silenced the Imperials within. I had never wanted a drink more than how my throat begged for slake in that moment. Raw, I remember the word over and over, raw like hot sand baked firm under Diadoca's unwavering light. A hush. This, too, is what I remembered, a hush that fell over the battle, an oppressive veil that descended upon all combatants. The anno pretenders inside the doors of the throne even ceased their damnable singing. Tyrant approached, placed a hand upon Antigonus, and spoke whispers to him, and fair Antigonus did stand to his full height, to place his own hand on Tyrant's enameled shoulder. Craterus rose from his slouch cover, and Tyrant lifted him up, and placed his hand on his opposite shoulder. I stood to the side. Tyrant smiled, and spoke to me, asking, "The claimants resist beyond this door?" And to him I could not speak, but nod. He drew his glittering sword made from starfall, and pointed it to the door and commanded it open. There was a moment of great groaning protest, then the door swung open, and from it charged our foes. A great and bloody melee ensued, Antigonus and Craterus and I standing as the personal guard to Tyrant himself, at the head of our great army as it clashed in the corridors of the throne. We traded blade and blow with the lords and glorious commanders of the empire, whose names were blessed themselves by Passacalia's own lips, and whose raiments were the finest electrum and adamantine, whose weapons smoked with light heat, whose own forms were not the containers of their own will. We struck them down, made mortal once more their soft flesh, each bite my bayonet 8 of them, a land was made free in posterity, our was the righteous fight, the setting of a broken bone, as we tore them down, we made a land whole. And then the last fell, and the long tall steps up to the throne itself Tyrant did walk. None attempted to follow, but to fall upon a knee, mutter a prayer for water and peace and thanks for a life beyond this one. I watched as Tyrant, approaching the royal form of the dead Anno, did set down his starfall blade, did lift from the royal form the seat of empire, did throw the royal form down from its sepulchre throne and, sitting himself upon it, rest the form's heavy crown on his own head, and speak to us his true name. Tyrannus. Excerpt from the Memoir and Notes of Baron Cassandrand. After declaring himself Tyrannus, a significant number of the successor claimants' levies and conscripts around the capital surrendered and pledged their service to the man who had been Tyrant. No other claimant was able to sit the throne, therefore, Tyrannus must be the true successor. Today, Tyrant's landing is widely regarded in the baronies as a cruel but necessary action, the only way, various histories claim, of breaking the stalemate. As a broken bone must be reset in order to heal, wrote Baron Cassandrand in his Memoir and Notes, so too did Tyrannus need to reset the annorum. Hello there, if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and click that notification bell button. If you really want to support my channel, you could visit my Patreon page, or buy me some coffee, links in the description. Anyway, have a nice day.